Wow, you guys have really outdone yourselves this time with the source material. We are going to take a deep dive today into the baby boomers,
Yeah.
specifically their formative years in the 50s and 60s, all through the lens of this really fascinating material you sent in.
And more than just the timeline of events, what we really want to get at are the core insights, right?
Right.
The big shifts that happened during that time, the experiences that really defined the boomers, and most importantly, what it all means for us today. Why does this matter? Even decades later.
Right, exactly. I mean, we're talking about this huge generation, people born from 1946 to 1964. They come into this world totally reshaped by World War II. And there was this feeling, I guess, at the beginning of things finally looking up, like a real sense of optimism, like anything was possible.
Yeah, but it's not that simple.
Mhm.
This era, it's full of contradictions.
Uh,
On the one hand, you have this pressure to conform, this idea of fitting in, but then at the same time, there's this other energy building,
mhm.
right? This desire to break free, to rebel against the status quo. And there is this growing wealth for a lot of people, but also this underlying fear, this uncertainty about what the future holds. You have this image of innocence on the surface, but beneath that, you have massive social changes brewing.
Yeah, so much happening at once. So let's start with the 50s, right? The sources we have paint this picture of stability. These new suburbs popping up, the white picket fence becomes this kind of symbol of the American dream. More and more families have two cars. And then, of course, there's television.
Television, right. I mean, that's the big thing here. It just explodes onto the scene and it becomes central to life in America. It happens so fast. And suddenly, families all over the country, no matter where they are, they're watching the same shows, sharing this common experience. Like you mentioned, Leave It to Beaver, right? It's like this idealized image of American family life. But think about the impact of that, of everyone watching the same thing.
Yeah.
It creates this sense of a shared national identity, of shared values. But it also maybe unintentionally, shows who's not included in that ideal.
That's a really interesting point. So you have this image of conformity being broadcast into living rooms everywhere. But at the same time, as you said, there are all these other things bubbling under the surface. The 50s weren't just all rosy suburban life, right?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, think about the civil rights movement. This is where the groundwork is being laid. You have figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks starting to really come to the forefront, and they're directly challenging racial inequality, which was so deeply ingrained in society. But this is important. These weren't just isolated incidents. They're a sign of this growing awareness, this demand for change that's starting to build momentum, even in this seemingly conformist society.
And then that momentum explodes in the 60s. The sources describe it as, well, complete upheaval. This vibrant counterculture emerges, and it feels like a direct response, a reaction against those 50s norms.
Yeah, absolutely. And this wasn't just about, young people liking different music or clothes.
Yeah.
This was a fundamental shift.
Yeah.
Questioning of authority of all these systems and structures. They rejected established norms in every way, from how they acted to what they wore to their political beliefs. They were asking why. But all these things that their parents' generation just accepted as the way things were.
And music plays this huge role. The sources specifically talk about Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Joan Baez. It's like they weren't just singers and songwriters. They were giving voice to this desire for something different, providing the soundtrack for this generation that felt like no one was listening to them.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. Think about Dylan and Baez, right? Their protest songs, they weren't just popular tunes. The lyrics were directly addressing things like civil rights and the Vietnam War. They brought these conversations into the mainstream, made people confront these really difficult issues. It shows how art can be more than just entertainment. It can be a driving force for change. And then you have the Beatles. Their music was always evolving, the sound, the message, and it really captured that spirit of exploration that defined the 60s. That sense of let's question everything and see what we find.
So you have all this social and cultural change within the US, but the sources also talk about these major global events that had a huge impact on the boomer generation. Like the Cold War, that constant threat of nuclear war must have created so much anxiety.
It's hard to really grasp that level of fear today, right? Like events like the Cuban Missile Crisis. It brought the world so close to the brink of annihilation. That experience, that collective feeling of, this is it, this could be the end, it had to leave a mark. Imagine growing up with that knowledge, with that possibility hanging over your head. It shapes how you see the world in a fundamental way.
But then, in contrast to that fear, you have this incredible achievement, the symbol of hope. The moon landing. The sources call it a testament to human ingenuity. our ability to overcome these huge, seemingly impossible challenges.
Right, and that's the fascinating thing here. On one hand, you have this fear of total destruction, and on the other, this demonstration of what humans are capable of.
Yeah.
It creates this duality, this tension between fragility and possibility. And I think that might explain why later on you see boomers embracing things like technological advancement, while also being deeply concerned about global issues. You know, they've seen both the best and the worst of what we can do.
The sources also mention some key figures who really defined this era.
Mhm.
People like John F. Kennedy. His presidency and then his assassination seemed to be a real turning point for a lot of people.
Yeah, and Kennedy's interesting because he represented this youthful optimism, this call to service that really resonated with young people. His assassination wasn't just a tragedy. It was a moment of disillusionment, that early optimism, that hope. It was shattered. And it became this shared memory for the baby boomer generation,
Hmm.
this moment that marked the end of a certain kind of innocence.
And then there's Betty Friedan and her book, The Feminine Mystique. That seems to have been a really crucial moment for the second wave of feminism.
Yeah, the feminine mystique, it was like Frieden gave a name to this feeling that so many women had, this dissatisfaction, this feeling of being trapped. She called it the problem that has no name. It was the idea that women were capable of and deserved more than just being wives and mothers. And that book, it started a national conversation. It challenged all those traditional expectations.
Hmm.
And it's considered a major catalyst for the women's movement, leading to all these changes in women's rights.
And of course, we can't forget Neil Armstrong, that first step on the moon. The sources talk about him as a symbol of limitless possibilities, which connects back to that optimism we were talking about. It's like, yeah, the world has all these problems, but look what we can achieve.
Exactly. And all these figures, they represent that challenge to the status quo. They inspired people to question what they'd been told and to imagine something different. Whether it was about social justice, gender roles, or technological progress, they showed that change was possible.
It's also interesting how the sources emphasize the rise of mass media, especially television. I mean, the baby boomers were the first generation to grow up with it, with TV being such a constant presence in their lives.
Think about how new that was. Suddenly you had moving images and sound right there in your living room. Television became the main source of information, of entertainment, even for shared cultural references. It shaped how they saw the world, their aspirations, their fears. What they saw on TV, it became a huge influence on their worldview.
And the assassination of JFK is a powerful example of that. It was one of the first major tragedies that people experienced in real time through television, watching it unfold on their screens. And that created this shared collective memory for an entire generation.
Absolutely. And it created this sense of national unity and grief, everyone watching this tragedy unfold together.
Hmm.
But it also showed the power of television, right? This ability to shape public consciousness, to create these really strong emotional memories. It changed how we experience events as a society.
So, taking all of this into account, all these formative experiences, how can understanding this historical context help us connect with baby boomers today? The sources offer some interesting insights for our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? Why does this history matter today? Well, the sources emphasize the importance of empathy, really listening to their stories, understanding that their values come from these specific experiences. It's crucial for connecting with them.
It's about recognizing everything they've lived through and contributed, right? And the wisdom they've gained from navigating all these periods of change.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it. They went from the 50s to the 60s, from relative stability to massive upheaval. They've seen so much change and they've adapted. And even though they didn't grow up with the internet or smartphones, many of them have embraced technology. It's about meeting them where they are, recognizing their willingness to keep learning and adapting.
The sources also mention things like health and wellness and financial planning, which of course are important for everyone, but maybe even more so for this generation as they get older.
Right. Sharing information about staying healthy, having those open conversations about retirement and finances, those are really important ways to connect with and support them.
And then there are these, I guess you could call them outside the box ideas, like encouraging conversations between different generations.
Yeah, those intergenerational dialogues are so valuable. It's a chance for younger people to learn from the experiences of the boomers to gain a different perspective. And the boomers can learn from the younger generation too. It builds mutual respect and understanding, which is something we need more of.
And then there's this idea of encouraging creative outlets. Things like art, writing, music. It seems like a really insightful suggestion, especially considering how important those things were to the boomer generation when they were younger.
Absolutely. I mean, those creative activities can give them a sense of purpose, of connection, even joy. And it allows them to tap back into those passions they may have discovered during those really vibrant decades of their youth.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the baby boomer generation, what's the main takeaway? What's the key insight you hope our listeners will remember?
I think the main thing, and this is emphasized throughout the sources, is that the boomer generation is incredibly resilient. They adapted to huge societal changes, they faced down fears, they embraced new possibilities, they've seen it all, and they've kept going.
And understanding their past, all those experiences that shaped them, is crucial. Not just for appreciating them, but for closing that gap between generations. For finding ways to understand each other better and work together.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our shared history is richer when we try to understand the perspectives of those who came before us.
So today, we've journeyed through the 50s and 60s, exploring the world of the baby boomers through all this amazing material you sent in. We looked at the contrasts, the defining moments, the lasting influence of this era.
And thinking about those contrasts, that push and pull between conformity and rebellion, between fear and hope, how do you see those same tensions playing out in our world today? And what can we learn? What can future generations learn from how the boomers navigated those challenges?
Lots to think about, right?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.